The African continent is facing a mounting debt crisis. The United Nations says 8 countries are already in a debt distress, while 13 are expected to be in a debt risk. The continent has suffered major economic setbacks since 2020, from the COVID-19 pandemic to debt-ridden governments due to poor political leadership and coups. Zambia managed to strike a deal to restructure its $6.3 billion debt owed to foreign investments, including China, while Niger has defaulted. For more on this worrying discussion, we're now joined by Ndongo Samba Sylla, a development economist and the Africa Head of Research and Policy at the International Development Economics Associates. He joins us from Dakar in Senegal to unpack this conversation. Ndongo, great to speak to you on Africa Today. Now, let's talk about some of these challenges, the debt crisis that seems to have befallen most of Africa. Africa is home to most of the world's natural resources, but still finds itself in all this debt. What are some of the challenges that result in the debt that is owed by so many African countries?
Well, one aspect of this debt crisis is linked to the fact that most of the African countries are still commodity producers. For example, they would export hydrocarbons, cocoa, cotton, etc. And generally, these commodities are subject to some volatility in terms of their pricing, but generally also their prices tend to diminish over the long run. That is what is generally called as the secular deterioration of the terms of trade. And the thing is that most of the countries, even when they sell their commodities, they do not manage to valorize them in the sense that of retaining the maximum of their export incomes through better taxation. And this is somehow linked with the unfairness of the global tax system. But one of the reasons is also that many African countries, they tapped on the international financial markets. So that means that they issued sovereign bonds on the international financial markets. And generally, the economists have observed what has been called the African premium, meaning that the African sovereigns generally pay much more than the other sovereigns, even if they have a comparable financial and economic status. And obviously, when you have a global crisis, countries that are exposed to private debt, they have generally more difficulty to adjust. And the thing is also, there is no functional way to at least make sure that the sovereigns, when they have debt problems, balance of payment problems, they could have a functional way of restructuring their debts. And this is a limitation of the global financial system.
So I'm no economist, but Ghana recently put their foot down as far as cocoa is concerned, and the need to create more beneficiation locally. Now, if we again use Botswana as an example and what they've been able to do with their diamonds, and certainly that relationship with De Beers, if I'm not mistaken, it is probably an illustration of what more African countries should be doing. Is that the case?
Well, it's not that all African countries are doing that, but some of them. Botswana had been a country with strong rates of economic growth, let's say between 1996 and 2000, because they managed to have a higher share of their diamond exports. In the case of Ghana, that has not been the case, because we would often observe that the profits and dividend repatriated out of the country generally have been very sizable. And we could also see the same trend in countries like Zambia, which exports copper. But the thing is that this debt crisis shows many things. The economic specialization of African countries, most of them are not industrialized, so they sell commodities. The fact that African sovereigns, they pay more interest rates than the other sovereigns. The fact that when you are in debt difficulty, well, you will have the IMF, which will impose punitive sanctions that would just postpone the debt crisis, but will not fundamentally address it. You see, one thing to say is that the African countries generally, they are not the most indebted in absolute term and relative term. For example, when the sovereign debt is compared to the GDP. Africa is not the most indebted. But the problem is that African countries are indebted in foreign currency. So that means you have to earn the income. And sometimes when you face a crisis, it's really difficult to get the funding from abroad.
So that's potentially the major difference between African countries and other developing countries that are borrowing, then, is it not? That they're able to pay debt off in their own currencies, whereas African countries are using international denominations. It's the US dollar, it's the euro, and so on.
Yeah, in fact, you could finance yourself, by trying to issue debt in your own domestic currency. After the issue is whether you allow foreign investors to come in or not, because when you allow foreign investors to come in, it's a kind of a disguise, debt in foreign currency. The thing is that most African countries, if they design well their currency system, their monetary system, they could allow to finance themselves what they could do, because you need US dollar to buy things you can't do. But all the things you could do yourself, you don't need to borrow in foreign currency. So these are the kind of thinking that would be needed from the African policymakers. And this occasion could be provided by a conference we will be organizing at the end of March 27 to 29 in Accra, where we'll invite policymakers from the continent and beyond, academics, civil society organization, to discuss about what could be an African response to the debt crisis we are living. What kind of economic models, but also what kind of debt templates to negotiate, with the IMF, for example, in terms of debt restructuring, because there are some countries which have already defaulted, like Ethiopia, Ghana, and Zambia, and we need to make sure that these countries restructure their debt in a way that do not compromise their economic prospect for the long term. So this will be in Accra, end of March 27 to 29, organized by IDEAS, the International Development Economic Associates, with its partners.
Ndongo, if we look at a trading bloc such as the European Union, and then we try to juxtapose ECOWAS, SADC, the East African Community, for instance, what do you see as a major differences that result in one being more prosperous or able to push a greater agenda, offer greater support to its members than the other?
Well, for example, if you take ECOWAS, there have been some achievement, for example, in the free circulation of the free movement of people. The SADC is more integrated in terms of trade. But the thing is, we have to push forward African integration in the sense of, for example, allowing for our countries to trade using their own currencies, but also to have common programs to have food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and also more integration in terms of infrastructure between the different countries. When you have these capacities, maybe that could help you prevent debt crisis, because debt crisis generally are suffered by countries who are not that industrialized. So industrialization is really important, but you have to have a good context of regional integration for that.
Now, finally, in what ways can international financial architecture be reformed to better support African countries in managing debt levels?
Well, there are many avenues which we will explore during our conference. For example, the global tax architecture is not favorable to African countries. You have these non-double taxation treaties which are harmful to the continent. You have the deficiency in terms of access to financing, because the financing African sovereign general have access to, generally they pay high interest rates, and that is not economical for them. And when these countries are in debt default, generally the condition imposed by the IMF are detrimental to long-term growth. And these are aspects that should be taken into account if we are to, prevent debt crisis. There are also other aspects linked with the way these institutions like the IMF, the World Bank are governed. we need more voices, more weight from Africa and the other countries from the global south.
Fully agree, Ndongo. Thanks so much for speaking to us. Ndongo Samba Sylla, development economist at the Africa Head of Research Policy at the International Development Economics Associates, and he was speaking to us from Dakar in Senegal.